Hi, my name's David Vizard, and you are watching PowerTech 10. Give me a few minutes of your time, and I will give you the benefit of my over 50 years of race-winning engine building. In this episode of PowerTech 10, I'm going to revisit an old friend. Many years ago, I did some dyno testing on the then relatively new Edelbrock Performer RPM heads. I subsequently recommended people to use them. And quite recently, somebody called me up and said, "Is what I said all those years ago still relevant?" And my answer was, well, they were good back then. I can't imagine that they got worse. It's Edelbrock. And he said that he got a set lined up, brand new. The guy decided not to use them. And so he had bought them. And would I like to check them out and see if they were worth keeping? So that's exactly what I did. And during the little back and flow testing these heads and that, we got into a conversation as to whether or not I should port them. I decided I would give that a go, and that's what you're going to see in this episode. The moves I made on this, the latest version of the Edelbrock RPM heads. They've made a few changes which I'll bring up as we go. So let's get cracking. Here's our Edelbrock Performer RPM right out of the box. Just giving it a quick once over like this, it looks a pretty nicely made piece. Now, one of the first things I noticed that's different from when I last saw one of these is that it would appear that they've done a port matching job here and cleaned the port up for a couple of inches in. Also, I see the same kind of tactic used on the exhaust. They're nicely cleaned up. I don't know if they match a particular gasket or not, but we'll find out. Now the chambers, they are, my first critique of the chambers is that they are not very much deshrouded here. It looks like there's some potential to be had by deshrouding them. Why did they do that? Well, it's possible that these heads have to fit more than one model, and there's some factor that makes this type of chamber more, how shall I say, universal than others. But don't take my word for that, that's just my first guess. As far as the hardware is concerned, we've got hardened steel plates. It looks like some nice studs. The springs look good, and they've got a relatively lightweight retainer. So the first thing we're going to do is investigate the springs, because if these heads will RPM, they'll have to have a spring that's pretty decent for the job. So that's our first move. Strip down a head and then take a look at the springs. First thing to do is to compress the springs and remove the valves. You won't need the mother and father of all spring compressors for this. These springs are pretty strong, but a good spring compressor like my Goodson spring compressor here will do the job. It's not a cheapo one, but it's not expensive either. The springs on these Edelbrock heads are not horrendously stiff, but they are a lot stiffer than stock. Here we have one. It's a good quality spring with a damper and a relatively light retainer. We'll investigate just what this spring's capabilities are in a short while. You can see the port matching is carried quite a ways back. So also the pinch point has been widened out to about as wide as you'd need to go safely. Now, this is the bit that impresses me about these lower priced Edelbrock heads, is that the bowls of both the intake and exhaust are blended. The short side turn on both of them is step free. We'll see how that works out when we flow test. In much the same way as the intake, the exhaust is blended pretty far back. In fact, on this particular port, and I think it applies to most of them, the blending carries on right to the seat. Running the spring through its paces proved to be a nice surprise. Well, I shouldn't say a nice surprise, but it's nice. The spring itself appears to be a good quality spring. 123 pounds on the seat at 1.8 inches. And if you're running a 550 lift cam, which is about what it's geared to run, 575 being a maximum, then you're going to have about 275 pounds over the nose. It's designed for flat tappet hydraulic cam or a roller hydraulic cam. Now a little bit about the spring in general here. First off, what makes this spring a fairly good piece here is that the mass of the spring itself, for the poundage it delivers, is low. This is an 88 gram spring, and with the damper, which is a nice fit in there, so that's a quality damper, it's 104. This gives us a resonant frequency of about 31,000 cycles a minute. That is good. That comes up in the higher level of spring technology for what we're applying it to here. So, good hardware. Also, last point, the retainer itself for a steel retainer is light. We checked out the combustion chambers for volume. Edelbrock quote 70 cc's, but there's an optional 64. We had the 70 cc's and they checked out between 70.8 and 71. The flow testing that I do here at the school is far more in-depth than you'll see in most flow tests. Actually, probably the most in-depth you'll see in any flow test other than somebody that's been to my classes here. Now, to get these much more in-depth results so that we know what we're looking at, we have to spend some time putting in data. For instance, we got to put the port volume in, we've got to put the valve size in, the stem diameter, throat diameter, the intake center line length, the bore size we are on, the port diameter there, valve diameter, etc. all down here, the corner radii of the intake and exhaust, and so it goes on. We also have to put in the compression ratio into here that we're going to run, and the max valve lift so that it can run through these calculations here to tell us what our intake to exhaust flow ratio should be and what we actually have. Here's our corrections here, and from all this we get not just efficiency figures like are here and velocity here, but such things as port energy density, peak velocities between the seats, etc., etc. It's a whole bunch of stuff, right? And it's all relevant. And at the end of the day, the program can compute very accurately how much torque and horsepower the engine is going to make on these cylinder heads. Now that's something that most flow bench programs just can't do, period. Well, there we go. That's the last bit of flow testing and entering the data. So now let's have a look and see what it is we've got. Okay, well, I've entered all the flow test results, and that's in these two columns here, observed flow. right? This has resulted, when I press the calculate button over here, this has resulted in the corrected intake and exhaust flow over here. Now this might be sounding like we've done the major work here and this is telling us what we want to know, but actually it's barely the tip of the iceberg. All this data that we entered up here is now going to come into play, right? Not only has this program so far calculated the corrected intake and exhaust, but also the SAE discharge coefficients here, the required intake to exhaust ratio, the existing one here in this, that's a unique feature, the port velocity in feet per second, and a whole lot of things that don't show on this chart yet, but these are just the major things. Let's take a look now at how these numbers look in graphic form, because most of you won't be familiar with flow test characteristics. So let's quit this here, go to this one here and calculate that there and graph it. Here is our flow graph, right? These are the numbers. At 700 lift, and we're not going to be lifting there, we had 226 CFM. We're going to be lifting near 500, so I'm going to say we'll, or I should say 575. So we're going to be around about 224 CFM at our peak flow under the conditions given by the camshaft selection. As you can see, we've got a rapid leveling out here, so we need to ask why that would be so. Also, we can see that the exhaust port is just okay, right? But before we go any further, let's see what these heads will make as is. Of course, unless you're used to looking at flow curves, these figures are going to mean very little. Now, we've got some issues here that we need to address. First off, why is this topping itself off here? And why isn't this exhaust curve any better than it is? It's okay. There's many cylinder heads in this category that flow about the same, maybe not even as much. And the same goes for the intake. So in that respect, this Edelbrock head is following, how shall I say, typical flow figures for the class of head that you're getting and the port size. But now, is this chopping off due to port size, or is it chopping off due to something else? Can this be improved on? Well, let's look at that. We need to have a means of seeing these cylinder heads in a light that is more applicable to extracting information. Let's do that now. What we're looking at in this graph here is the SAE coefficient of discharge of the valve. Now, fancy sounding title, but the bottom line is it's the efficiency with which the valve utilizes the area available to it at any point in the opening and closing phase. The blue is the intake, the red is the exhaust. Now we can see down here at low valve lift, neither of them are lacking in flow efficiency. They're almost 75% flow efficiency, which means that Edelbrock did a nice job on the valve seats. But as we lift the valves up, so they drop in efficiency quickly, the intake drops below 50% and stays there. The exhaust comes down to around about 52%, and it starts to climb up. Now, this is a characteristic that we need to seek with cylinder heads, right? two things this tells us. One, the port's dropping off too quick, and two, the intake isn't regaining its efficiency as it could well be capable of. So is this from a port too small or some other factor? Well, I can tell you now that the gain in this here, after passing this red line, which is a quarter of the valve diameter in terms of lift, this is something that not only should we seek, but it can be had fairly easily by making sure that the port is biased and shaped in the bowl right. This didn't make it. Now, that could have been because it had a very small port, or it's not biased enough. What we're looking at here is the port velocity. And as it happens, the magic number for port velocity is to achieve 300 feet per second at peak valve lift. Well, we're going to lift somewhere around about here. As you can see, the intake port reaches the 300 mark just about. The exhaust port doesn't. So the exhaust port flow needs to go up without any major change in port volume. So that's one thing we have to work on, and I'm sure that will happen very easy. The port looks like it's ready to go and just needs detailing. So here we go, the port velocity. Now let's go down to the next factor here and look at the port energy. Now this is something you probably won't be familiar with. Intake port energy, it's looking pretty good. Exhaust port energy, not so good, right? For a typical small block Chevy cylinder head, this is slightly above average, and that comes about for having some decent flow figures for the amount of port volume that the intake has. Here we can go back to the opening page. All of that information that we put into the flow chart itself, would be flow test 1, now starts to pay off. We've got the mean port area here that it's calculated. We know what the flow is at the lift concerned. We've put in the bore and stroke, and we have the displacement of engine, etc. We've put the compression ratio in and calculated it. Now these heads are intended for a guy who wants to build a 383 for the street, wants peak power at 5,800 RPM. Well, with this port area and this flow, our peak power is going to be at 5,145 RPM. And based on the area, it's going to be 443 horsepower and 514 foot-pounds of torque, right? He wants to see something near 500 horsepower, and from experience I can tell you that's a very doable figure. So what are we short on? Well, we need to increase the port area and we need to increase the flow for him to be able to hit his targets there. Right, so that will be our next move, is to look at what has to be done to these ports. Here's the block that I intend to use to mark out the bores. These bores are already finished at 4.03 for the stroker crank that it's going to receive, which will give it 383 inches. So let's get with it and put the head onto the block, or the heads onto the block. Using this scriber, I'm going to mark around the cylinders at the bottom of each bore. So that will be our next move. Do that on each one. Here is the cylinder head marked out. As you can see, the chambers came very close to the edge of the bores here. Virtually that's the thickness of a line off there. You can probably better see it here. Right, so now the first move is we're going to use this flow ball, which I've set the valve up here, to deshroud it round here so that the ball comes out. Right, so that's our first move. Now we're coming to the second stage of our deshrouding of the intake. Notice the size of these two flow balls. Right, first I'm going to lift the intake by this much. Right, then I'm clearancing the chamber to there, right? Next, I lift the valve to this much and I clearance the chamber with this ball, right? Let's put that one in. Right, now, this one pulls out just there. The other one pulled out just here. Lastly, I'm going to pull this one through, and that's where it needs to pull through. So the 5/16 ball pulled through here, the 3/8 one pulled through there, and the 1/2 inch one pulls through here. Now, it's useful to get a kind of a channel through here because we're making these clearances bigger because the air is not coming in like this, it's coming in across the valve like this. So more air needs to be able to get by the valve here than there. I'm now going to do the same, use the same technique on the exhaust and then clean this up and then we'll flow test it. On the exhaust, I'm only going to use this ball and I'll lift the valve by that much and clearance it by that much, and that's so that I can area rule the exhaust. When this exhaust valve first opens, the flow is supersonic. Doesn't care about discharge coefficient, only area available. And that's so I'm just going to use this and that should cover the first 200 thousandths lift. I'm not going to take too much from here because the flow here will get too high speed and it will shut off this side of the valve and that will be a net loss. The 3/16 diameter ball is what we use to do a clearance on the shrouding on the exhaust valve. Now you'll see that it pulls through everywhere except where the bore is closer than 3/16. Right, that's from this area here to here. Everywhere else it will slip through. Next step, clean up the chambers and back on the flow bench. Here's our before and after flow curves for our deshrouded versus stock chamber. Now it may look at first as if shrouding wasn't the big problem. On the exhaust we did see a gain pretty much everywhere, but mostly in the lower mid-range. On the intake we just started to show a gain and then suddenly it dropped off. Why would that be? We can actually tell better by looking at the discharge coefficients because our deshrouding may have been working, but this blockage here was due to reaching a critical point on some other aspect of the port. Let's look at our CD curves. Well, here's our discharge coefficient figures, or if you prefer to give it a more simple term, our flow efficiency curves. Right? What we can see is that low down, our deshrouding has done something, but as we get up to here, zero gains. If this line doesn't do something like this, a la this, then it's almost a sure sign that we have a bias problem, i.e. not enough bias. If the air can't get past the boss on the cylinder wall side, no amount of deshrouding will make any difference, because there's no extra air flowing at this point to pay off the deshrouding mod. Let's look at a port and see what we've got going here. Here's where I've taken off most of the metal. I've skinned the guide boss down on this side here, increased the size of this bowl, and I've paid particular attention to this gap across here. Most of the air is flowing on the roof of the port, and it would like to go this way so long as it's got room across here. So make sure that this here is not bulging out to the seat and that it comes virtually straight up. But here you can undercut the seat slightly so that it's going like that. That's going to encourage the air to come around and out this way, or it's going to give it room to do that. So let's see how that works out for us. But first let's look at the exhaust. The same thing was done with that, with just a slight lesser degree. Here's the exhaust port. It's a bit overlit compared with the rest of it, but I'm sure you can see what's going on here. This is the cylinder wall side of the port. The exhaust is going to be going out this way here. So I've cut this here, skinned it, this side of the guide boss down, and opened up this area here and give it a much more smooth turn into that there. That's it. We're going to now see if this extra bias emanating either to or away from the center of the cylinder pays off. At this point, we've kind of run out of time on what we can put into one video. So I'm going to leave you with a cliffhanger here. Did the offsetting or increasing the bias on those ports actually do much? Just check out part 2. Oh, and before I go, I'd like to make a request, right? If you really like these videos, hit the like button. And it would be a great help if you also hit the subscribe button. We need to get the word out there as far and wide as possible. The more people we get on the site, the more we can delve into the depths of high-tech tuning. Thank you for watching. I'll see you over the other side on part 2.